The morning bell at Westridge High School rang like it did every day at 7:30 sharp. Students poured through the front doors, their voices bouncing off the walls in a jumble of laughter, complaints about homework, and plans for the weekend. Carlos Mendez moved his mop carefully along the edge of the hallway, his movements practiced and efficient after 17 years on the job. "Watch out!" a boy called out, as a basketball flew past Carlos's head, missing him by inches. The boy grabbed the ball without an apology or even a glance at the man in the gray uniform. Carlos didn't mind. He was used to being invisible. He continued his work, moving steadily down the hallway as students flowed around him like water around a stone in a stream. This was his morning routine, cleaning up the muddy footprints and scattered papers left. In the wake of 800 teenagers starting their day, Principal Walker strode past, talking into his phone about budget meetings. He gave Carlos a quick, distracted nod without breaking his conversation. It was more acknowledgement than most gave him, and Carlos appreciated it with a slight nod in return. At 52, Carlos had the kind of face that seemed both kind and tired. His salt and pepper hair was always neatly trimmed, and his uniform, though faded from countless washes, was clean and pressed. His hands, once smooth and graceful, had grown rough and calloused from years of scrubbing floors, fixing leaky pipes and hauling trash bags twice his weight. "Mr. M," called a voice that made Carlos look up and smile. It was Lily Chen, one of the few students who actually saw him. "Good morning, Lily," he said, his words carrying the gentle accent of his homeland. "Ready for your math test?" Lily groaned dramatically. "As ready as I'll ever be. Thanks for the good luck flower." She pointed to her backpack where she'd pinned the small paper flower Carlos had taught her to fold last week when he found her crying in the hallway about her parents' divorce. "You don't need luck," Carlos said. "Just remember what I told you. Take a deep breath and trust what I know," she finished with a smile. "I will. See you later." She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Carlos with a warmth in his chest. These small connections were precious to him. The first bell rang and the hallway cleared quickly, doors slamming shut as classes began. In the sudden quiet, Carlos could work more freely, moving his mop in wide arcs across the floor. "Carlos, we need you in the cafeteria," came a voice over his walkie-talkie. Someone dropped an entire tray of spaghetti. "On my way," he replied, turning his cart around. The cafeteria was empty except for a flustered lunch lady pointing at the mess. "Thank goodness you're here. What a disaster." Carlos smiled. "No problem, Mrs. Patel. I've seen worse." As he worked, his mind drifted as it often did to another life, another time. His thoughts moved to the rhythm of his hands, a rhythm that once created something far different than clean floors. He remembered his mother's small house in El Salvador, how the afternoon light would filter through the windows as his fingers danced across the keys of their old upright piano. It had been his grandfather's, brought over from Spain. Its ivory keys yellowed with age, but the sound still rich and true. Carlos had been a child prodigy, playing Chopin by age 6, composing his own pieces by 12. By 20, he was performing, with the National Symphony, his future bright with promise. "Carlos? Earth to Carlos." Mrs. Patel's voice broke through his memories. "You've been mopping the same spot for 5 minutes." He blinked, looking down at the spotless floor. "Sorry," he said with a small laugh. "Got lost in thought." "Well, while you're here, could you check the garbage disposal? It's making that sound again." Carlos nodded and put aside his mop. His days were filled with these small emergencies. Broken locks, flickering lights, clogged toilets. He was good with his hands, good at fixing things. People appreciated that about him, even if they didn't really see him. By lunchtime, the cafeteria was noisy again, filled with hungry teenagers. Carlos stayed along the edges, emptying trash cans and wiping down tables as they were abandoned. He caught fragments of conversations as he worked, complaints about teachers, gossip about weekend parties, worries about college applications. Sometimes when he closed his eyes, these voices blended into a kind of music. The high notes of excited chatter, the steady percussion of trays being set down, the deep bass of laughter. Music was everywhere if you knew how to listen. In the teacher's lounge during his break, Carlos sat alone by the window, eating the lunch he brought from home, a simple sandwich and an apple. The teachers around him discussed committee meetings and curriculum changes, their conversation flowing around him as if he weren't there. Ms. Reynolds, the music teacher, rushed in looking stressed. Her curly hair was escaping its clip, and she clutched a stack of sheet music. "I don't know how we're going to pull this fundraiser together," she was saying to Mr. Torres, the art teacher. "The music department budget has been cut so much that we can barely afford to repair instruments, let alone buy new ones." Carlos kept his eyes on his sandwich but listened carefully. Music had always drawn his attention, like a moth to flame. "And now I find out the piano in the auditorium is acting up again," Ms. Reynolds continued. "It was tuned just 6 months ago, but something's wrong with the action. Some of the keys are sticking and others sound completely off." "Can't the district send someone to fix it?" Mr. Torres asked. Ms. Reynolds sighed. "They said it's not in the budget until next quarter, but we need it for the fundraiser next week." Carlos felt a familiar itch in his fingers, the kind he got whenever he heard about a piano in distress. Before he could think better of it, he spoke up. "Excuse me, Ms. Reynolds," he said quietly. "Sometimes the humidity affects the hammers. I could take a look if you want." The teachers turned to him with surprise as if a chair had suddenly spoken. "Oh, thank you, Carlos," Ms. Reynolds said, clearly caught off guard. "But it's a very expensive instrument. We should probably wait for a professional." Carlos nodded and returned to his sandwich. Of course. What did a janitor know about concert grand pianos? The afternoon passed in a blur of classes and cleaning. After the final bell, Carlos moved through the empty classroom, straightening desks, wiping boards, and collecting forgotten items for the lost and found. A single glove, a math textbook, a hair clip shaped like a butterfly. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Carlos finished his daily rounds. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving the building quiet and still. This was his favorite time of day, when he could move through the school like it was his own, when he could hear his own thoughts. On his way to the maintenance closet, he passed the music room and paused. Through the window in the door, he could see the empty room, the afternoon light making the instruments glow. Guitars hung on the wall, violins rested in open cases, and in the corner sat a small, upright piano, much like the one he'd grown up with. Carlos glanced up and down the empty hallway. No one was around. No one would see. He slipped inside, set down his cleaning supplies, and moved silently to the piano. He sat on the bench, his work uniform looking out of place against the polished wood. His hands hovered over the keys, calloused and rough, so different from the smooth, nimble fingers of his youth. For a moment he just sat there feeling the weight of years and miles and lost dreams. Then, almost without conscious thought, his right hand came down gently, playing a simple C major chord. The sound filled the empty room, clear and true. Carlos closed his eyes, feeling something inside him uncoil, a spring that had been wound tight for 17 years. He began to play softly, a simple melody he had composed as a boy. His fingers remembered, even if they were stiffer now. Even if they stumbled occasionally over passages that once flowed like water. He played for himself, for the boy he had been, for the man he might have become in another life. What Carlos didn't know was that Ms. Reynolds had forgotten her grade book and had returned to retrieve it. As she walked down the hallway, she heard the gentle music flowing from her classroom. She slowed, then stopped outside the door, listening with growing wonder. The piece wasn't something she recognized, but it was beautiful, wistful, and sweet, like a memory of home. Who was playing? All the students had gone, and none of the other teachers would be in her room. Quietly, she peered through the window in the door and felt her jaw drop. There sat Carlos, the janitor who faded into the background of their school, days playing with the touch and expression of a trained musician. Ms. Reynolds stood frozen, not daring to enter, not wanting to break the spell. As the last notes faded, she saw Carlos bow his head, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. Then he closed the piano gently, stood up, and returned to his mop and bucket as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She backed away before he could see her, her mind racing with questions. By the time Carlos emerged from the music room, the hallway was empty again. That night, as Carlos rode the bus to his small apartment, he felt lighter somehow, as if he had set down a heavy load he'd been carrying for too long. His fingers tapped, silently against his knee, playing ghost melodies only he could hear. Tomorrow would be another day of being invisible. But for those few precious minutes, he had remembered who he truly was. The next morning, Carlos arrived at Westridge High earlier than usual. Sleep had been hard to come by after his moment at the piano, and he found himself drawn to the school in the quiet hours before the students arrived. The hallways were peaceful at 5:30 a.m., the only sound being the soft squeak of his cart's wheels as he moved through the building. He hummed quietly to himself, a melody from long ago that had been playing in his head all night. As he passed the main office, he noticed the light was on. Through the glass door, he could see Principal Walker already at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and looking more stressed than usual. Carlos hesitated, then knocked gently. "Come in," called Walker without looking up. "Good morning, sir," Carlos said. "Everything okay? You're here very early." Principal Walker finally looked up, his tired eyes taking a moment to focus. "Oh, Carlos, yes, just budget nightmares. The school board cut our funding again." He gestured to the papers spread across his desk. "I'm trying to figure out where we can save without hurting the students." Carlos nodded sympathetically. "Anything I can do to help?" Walker gave a small, sad smile. "Unless you can pull $20,000 out of thin air for our arts programs, I'm afraid not." "I wish I could," Carlos said quietly, then added, "The arts are important." "They are," Walker agreed with a sigh. "But try telling that to people who only care about test scores." He waved a hand. "Don't let me keep you from your work, and thanks for asking." Carlos continued down the hall, his mind turning over the principal's words. $20,000. It seemed like such an impossible number. By lunchtime, word had spread among the teachers about the budget cuts. Carlos overheard worried conversations as he cleaned up spills and emptied trash cans. "The music program will be hit hardest," Mr. Torres was saying to the gym teacher. "Ms. Reynolds is devastated. They might have to cancel the spring concert series entirely." "That's terrible," replied Coach Wilson. "My daughter was looking forward to performing." Carlos felt a pang in his chest. Music had been his salvation as a boy. The thought of students losing that opportunity saddened him deeply. After school, he made his way to the auditorium where the grand piano sat on the stage. He had a work order to fix a squeaky door, but his eyes kept drifting to the magnificent instrument under its protective cover. As he worked on the door hinges, he heard someone enter. Quickly, he focused on his task, not wanting to be caught staring at the piano again. "Oh, Carlos, I didn't know you were in here." It was Ms. Reynolds. Her eyes were slightly red, as if she'd been crying. "Just fixing this door, ma'am," he said, gesturing with his screwdriver. "I'll be done soon." "No rush," she said, walking toward the stage. "I just came to think." She sat heavily on the edge of the stage, looking out at the empty seats. "Did you hear about the budget cuts?" Carlos nodded. "Principal Walker mentioned it this morning." "I'm sorry." Ms. Reynolds sighed. "We've organized a fundraiser concert for next week, a last-ditch effort to save the program." She looked over at him with a weak smile. "But I'm not very hopeful." Carlos wanted to say something encouraging, but words failed him. Instead, he focused on fixing the door, tightening the final screw. "There," he said finally. "No more squeaking." "If only all problems were so easily fixed," Ms. Reynolds replied. She stood up and walked to the piano, running her hand along its covered surface. "I should probably practice for the fundraiser, but I just don't have the heart today." Carlos hesitated, then said, "Sometimes music is the best medicine for a heavy heart." Ms. Reynolds looked at him curiously. "That's a lovely thought, Carlos." She seemed to see him properly for the first time. "Have you always worked here? I feel like I don't know anything about you." 17 years, he answered. but there's not much to know. He gathered his tools, suddenly uncomfortable with her attention. I should get back to work. Good luck with the fundraiser. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as the school prepared for the fundraiser. Posters appeared in the hallways announcing, "Save the Music," with details about the concert. Students from the music department stayed late to practice, their music floating through the halls as Carlos cleaned. He found himself lingering near the practice rooms, listening to the young musicians. Some played with technical precision but little feeling. Others played with passion but missed notes. He remembered his own teacher's words from long ago. True music needs both the head and the heart. On Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the fundraiser, disaster struck. Carlos was changing light bulbs in the science wing when his walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Carlos, we need you in the auditorium right away," came the urgent voice of Ms. Reynolds. "There's something wrong with the piano." He hurried to the auditorium where he found Ms. Reynolds and 3 students standing around the grand piano looking distressed. "Listen," Ms. Reynolds said as soon as he entered. She played a scale, and Carlos immediately heard the problem. Several keys sounded terribly out of tune, and one made almost no sound at all. "It was fine yesterday," said a tall boy with glasses. "We practiced for hours and it sounded perfect." "Could someone have tampered with it?" asked another student. Ms. Reynolds shook her head. "The auditorium was locked all night." She turned to Carlos. "Is there anything you can do? The fundraiser is this Sunday." Carlos approached the piano cautiously. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the keyboard. Ms. Reynolds stepped aside. "Of course, but I'm not sure what you'll be able to tell." Carlos played a few notes, then a chord, his work-roughened fingers moving with surprising grace. The students exchanged glances, clearly surprised that the janitor could play at all. "The humidity changed overnight with the rain," he said finally. "And I think there's something loose inside. It needs adjustment." "Can you fix it?" Ms. Reynolds asked hopefully. Carlos hesitated. If he revealed too much knowledge about pianos, there would be questions he wasn't ready to answer. But looking at their worried faces, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. "I can try," he said, "but I'm not a professional piano technician. At this point, I'm willing to try anything," Ms. Reynolds said. "Our piano tuner is booked solid this week, and we can't afford emergency rates anyway." "I'll need some tools from my workshop," Carlos said, "and it's better if I work alone. The piano needs quiet to be properly adjusted." "Of course," Ms. Reynolds said quickly. "Whatever you need, I have a faculty meeting anyway." She turned to the students. "Let's give Mr. Mendez some space, shall we?" After they left, Carlos stood alone with the piano. He removed his work jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Then he carefully opened the top of the grand piano and looked inside at the complex mechanism of strings, hammers, and dampers. For the next 2 hours, Carlos lost himself in the familiar work. His hands remembered skills he hadn't used in nearly 2 decades, adjusting the tension of strings, realigning hammers, checking the action of each key. As he worked, he hummed softly, occasionally playing a note or chord to test his progress. He didn't hear the door open or notice Ms. Reynolds slip quietly into the back of the auditorium. She stood in the shadows, watching with growing amazement as Carlos worked with the confidence and precision of a master craftsman. Finally, Carlos closed the piano and sat on the bench. He took a deep breath and began to play, not just random notes this time, but a proper piece. His fingers moved over the keys, testing every register, every dynamic level. Ms. Reynolds recognized the piece. Bach's Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. It wasn't a showy piece, but it required perfect evenness and control. Carlos played it beautifully, with a sensitivity that spoke of years of training. When he finished, the last note hanging in the air, Ms. Reynolds couldn't help herself. She applauded. Carlos spun around, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Ms. Reynolds, I didn't hear you come in." "That was beautiful," she said, walking down the aisle toward the stage. "Where did you learn to play like that? And how do you know so much about piano mechanics?" Carlos looked down at his hands, now stained with piano dust and grease. "It was a long time ago," he said softly. "In another life." Before she could ask more questions, he stood up. The piano should be fine now. The action is smooth again, and I've tuned the strings that were affected by the humidity. Ms. Reynolds shook her head in disbelief. Carlos, you're full of surprises. She sat down at the piano and played a complicated passage. Her face lit up with delight. It sounds perfect, even better than before. I'm glad I could help, Carlos said, gathering his tools. I should get back to my regular duties now. Wait, Ms. Reynolds said, catching his arm. I have to ask, were you professionally trained? You're playing? Carlos gently pulled away. Please, Ms. Reynolds, I fixed the piano, that's all. But I need to finish my work, he said firmly, heading for the door. I'm glad the piano is ready for your fundraiser. That evening, as he rode the bus home, Carlos felt unsettled. He had revealed too much of himself today. The careful wall he had built between his past and present had cracked, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. At home, he heated up a simple dinner and ate while looking at an old photograph, the only one he had brought with him from El Salvador. It showed a young man in a tuxedo, standing proudly next to a concert grand piano. The prestigious National Theater was visible in the background. The young man's eyes shone with promise, with dreams, with music. Carlos touched the photograph gently. That was a different time, he whispered to his younger self. A different man. But as he prepared for bed, his fingers moved in the patterns of the Bach prelude, as if they had a memory of their own. And, for the first time in many years, Carlos Mendez wondered if the music inside him had truly died, or if it had merely been waiting for the right moment to play again. Carlos woke up at 4:30 the next morning, his dreams filled with music and memories. He sat at the edge of his bed looking at his hands in the dim light. The calluses from years of manual labor couldn't hide what these hands once were, the hands of an artist. He made his coffee and ate a simple breakfast, all while a melody played in his head. It was one he had composed himself years ago, for his mother's birthday. She had cried when he played it for her. My son, she had said, God gave you a gift, you must share it with the world. But the world had changed, and so had he. At school, Carlos went about his normal routine, but he felt different somehow. The wall he had built around his past felt thinner now. Twice he caught himself humming as he mopped the hallways, stopping abruptly when students walked by. During lunch period, Lily Chen found him replacing a light fixture outside the cafeteria. Mr. M, she said, looking up at him on his ladder. I heard what you did with the piano. Carlos nearly dropped his screwdriver. What? Ms. Reynolds told our class that you fixed it when no one else could. She said you saved the fundraiser. I just made a few adjustments, he said, focusing intently on the light fixture. Anyone could have done it. Lily shook her head. That's not what Ms. Reynolds said. She said you knew exactly what to do, like a professional. Carlos finished tightening the last screw and climbed down. Ms. Reynolds is being kind, that's all. Well, I think it's cool, Lily said. Most people don't know anything about the people who keep our school running. She glanced at the cafeteria door. I should go before lunch ends. See you around. Mr. M. As she left, Carlos felt a mix of emotions. Part of him was uncomfortable with the attention, but another part, a part he had silenced for years, felt a flicker of pride. The day continued uneventfully until final period, when Carlos was called to the gymnasium to clean up after a science experiment gone wrong. Apparently, the physics class had been studying projectile motion with water balloons outside, and the rain had forced them into the gym. The result was a soaked floor and some very apologetic students. He was still mopping when the final bell rang. Most of the teachers left quickly. It was Friday, after all. Carlos worked steadily, thinking about his quiet weekend ahead. Maybe he would visit the park if the weather cleared up. Maybe he would finally fix that leaky faucet in his bathroom, so he wheeled his mop bucket back to the maintenance closet. He passed the auditorium and paused. The door was slightly ajar and he could hear someone inside talking on the phone. Yes, I understand it's short notice, Ms. Reynolds was saying, her voice tight with stress. But this fundraiser is vital for our program. No, I can't postpone it again. Well, if that's your final answer, I guess we'll have to manage somehow. Thank you for your time. Carlos heard a frustrated sigh, then the sound of something being thrown. He hesitated, then knocked gently on the door. "Ms. Reynolds, everything okay?" There was a moment of silence, then, "Come in, Carlos." He pushed the door open to find Ms. Reynolds sitting on the edge of the stage, her phone clutched in her hand, looking defeated. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was just passing by and heard you sounded upset." She gave him a weak smile. "Our pianist for the fundraiser just canceled. His mother is in the hospital, so of course he needs to be with her, but..." She gestured helplessly. "The concert is on Sunday evening. That's less than 48 hours to find a replacement." Carlos shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure you'll find someone. In this town? On a weekend? For no pay?" She shook her head. "I've already called everyone I know. Most are already booked, and the few who aren't want more money than we can offer, which is basically nothing." She looked up at him suddenly. "Unless..." Carlos took a step back, already knowing what she was thinking. No, Ms. Reynolds, I can't. But you can play, I heard you, you play beautifully." "That was different. I was alone. I was just testing the piano." She stood up, her eyes bright with hope. "Carlos, you're not just good, you're exceptional. Your technique, your expression, you've had serious training." He looked away. "That was a long time ago. But you could still do it," she pressed. "You could save our fundraiser. Please, just consider it." "I'm the janitor," he said quietly, "not a performer." Ms. Reynolds stepped closer. "You're both, Carlos. I can see that now. Whatever your story is, whatever brought you here, the music is still in you." He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Images flashed through his mind. The concert hall in San Salvador, the spotlight, the applause. Then other images, the sound of gunfire, the hasty packing, the tearful goodbyes. "I can't," he said again, more firmly. "I'm sorry." Before she could respond, he turned and walked out, leaving his mop bucket behind. That night, Carlos couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with memories and fears. Around midnight, he got up and sat by his window, looking out at the quiet street below. A stray cat wandered by, its eyes reflecting the streetlight. In the distance, he could hear the faint wail of a siren. He thought about Ms. Reynolds and her desperate situation. He thought about the music program and what it meant to the students. He remembered Lily's words. "Most people don't know anything about the people who keep our school running." Perhaps it was time for people to know a little more about Carlos. Mendez. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool. Carlos had made his decision. He took the bus to school, knowing few people would be there on a weekend. He needed time alone with the piano. If he was going to do this, he needed to prepare. The school was quiet as he unlocked the side door with his master key. He moved through the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing. When he reached the auditorium, he paused, his hand on the door. Was he really going to do this? Yes, he decided. For the music, for the students, and maybe, just a little bit, for himself. The grand piano waited on the stage, bathed in the soft light filtering through the high windows. Carlos approached it slowly, with reverence. He sat down on the bench and closed his eyes, allowing himself to remember what it felt like to be a musician. He began with simple scales, his fingers remembering the patterns. Then arpeggios, faster and more complex. Finally, he played a piece he knew by heart, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It had always been his favorite, with its soft questioning beginning that built to a passionate, almost desperate climax. As he played, something inside him awakened. The years fell away, and he was no longer Carlos the janitor, but Carlos the pianist, the artist, the man he had once been. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget, the subtle shift of weight, the precise control of dynamics, the way to make the piano sing. He didn't hear the auditorium door open. He didn't notice Ms. Reynolds standing in the back, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she listened. He was lost in the music, in the moment, in the pure joy of playing without fear or constraint. When the final notes died away, he sat still, his hands resting on the keys, his heart full. Then he heard it, a single person clapping slowly, deliberately. He turned to see Ms. Reynolds walking down the aisle toward him, her face wet with tears but smiling broadly. "That," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard in this auditorium." Carlos stood up, embarrassed to be caught again. "I was just practicing," she finished for him, now standing at the edge of the stage. "For tomorrow night?" He took a deep breath. "Yes," he said finally. "If the offer still stands." Ms. Reynolds beamed at him. "Carlos, after what I just heard, I would be on my knees begging if the offer didn't stand." She climbed the steps to the stage and stood before him. "But I have to ask, who are you really? Where did you learn to play like that?" Carlos looked at her for a long moment. Then he gestured to the piano bench. "It's a long story. Maybe we should sit down." For the next hour, Carlos told her everything, about growing up in El Salvador, about his early talent at the piano, about studying at the National Conservatory and performing with the symphony. He told her about the Civil War that tore his country apart, about the threats his family received after he publicly refused to play at a government function, about the midnight escape across the border. "I left everything behind," he said, staring at his hands. "My music, my career, my identity. When I came to America, I was just another immigrant looking for work. The only job I could get was cleaning offices at night. Then I found this position at Westridge, and I've been here ever since." "But why didn't you try to continue with music here?" Ms. Reynolds asked. Carlos smiled sadly. "Fear at first. I was in a new country illegally with poor English. Then habit. It was easier to be invisible. And finally, I think I was afraid to find out if the music was still in me." "It is," Ms. Reynolds said softly. "Anyone who heard you just now would know that." They sat in silence for a moment, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, creating patterns on the stage floor. "So," Ms. Reynolds said finally, "what will you play tomorrow night?" Carlos thought for a moment. "Something simple to start. Maybe Bach, then the Chopin you just heard. And to finish..." He smiled, a real smile that lit up his face. "I think I'll play something of my own. Something I wrote a long time ago." Ms. Reynolds touched his arm. "Thank you, Carlos. Not just for saving our fundraiser, but for sharing your gift again. Music like yours shouldn't be hidden." As Carlos left the auditorium that morning, he felt lighter than he had in years. Tomorrow night he would play again. Not as the invisible janitor, but as the musician he had always been. He wasn't sure what would happen afterward. Would things change at school? Would people look at him differently? It didn't matter. For the first time in 17 years, he was no longer running from his past. He was embracing it. Saturday afternoon, Ms. Reynolds called an emergency meeting with the music students involved in the fundraiser. They gathered in the band room, sitting on chairs arranged in a semicircle, curious about the urgent summons. "I have news about tomorrow's concert," Ms. Reynolds announced, barely containing her excitement. "We have a new pianist." "Who?" asked a boy with a trumpet case on his lap. "Someone from the community college?" Ms. Reynolds smiled mysteriously. "Someone much closer to home. Someone we see every day but never really noticed." She paused for effect. "Mr. Mendez." There was a moment of confused silence. "The janitor?" a girl with a violin asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "Yes, Lisa, the janitor," Ms. Reynolds replied firmly. "And I can promise you, he plays more beautifully than anyone I've ever heard in this school." The students exchanged skeptical glances. One boy snickered behind his hand. "This isn't a joke," Ms. Reynolds said, her tone sharpening. "Mr. Mendez was once a concert pianist. He studied at a conservatory and performed with a national symphony orchestra." "Then why is he cleaning our school?" asked another student. Ms. Reynolds took a deep breath. "That's his story to tell if he chooses to." What matters is that he's helping us when we desperately need it. I expect you all to show him the same respect you would show any guest artist." Meanwhile, Carlos spent his Saturday afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation. He cleaned his apartment thoroughly, then stood before his small closet, frowning at its contents. He owned exactly one suit, purchased years ago for a cousin's wedding. He took it out and inspected it carefully. The style was dated, and it was a bit tight around the middle now, but it would have to do. He laid the suit on his bed, along with his one good shirt and his least scuffed pair of dress shoes. Then he sat at his kitchen table with a notepad, planning his program for the next evening. Bach to start, then Chopin, then his own composition. It felt strange and wonderful to be thinking like a musician again. Sunday morning, Carlos woke early, after a restless night. He made coffee and toast, but his stomach was too knotted to eat much. He tried to practice mentally, running through the pieces in his head, visualizing his fingers on the keyboard. It was a technique his old teacher had taught him. At noon, his phone rang, Ms. Reynolds checking in. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Nervous," he admitted. "I haven't performed in front of an audience in 17 years. "You'll be magnificent," she assured him, "just like you were yesterday. The auditorium will be full, by the way. Word has spread about our mystery pianist." Carlos felt his anxiety spike. "Full? How many people?" "The auditorium seats 400. We've sold over 300 tickets. Already." Carlos sat down heavily. "That's a lot of people." "It's for a good cause," Ms. Reynolds reminded him gently. "Think of the music program." After they hung up, Carlos paced his small apartment. What had he been thinking? He couldn't do this. He was a janitor, not a performer. People would laugh. He would make mistakes. He would embarrass himself and Ms. Reynolds. He picked up his phone to call her back to cancel, but something stopped him. He remembered the look on her face when she heard him play, the wonder, the joy. He remembered his promise to help save the music program. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that perhaps this was meant to be, that perhaps 17 years of silence was long enough. He put the phone down and went to shower and shave. Whatever happened tonight, he would face it with dignity. The afternoon crawled by. Carlos pressed his suit and polished his shoes. He trimmed his hair carefully. At 4 o'clock, he stood before his mirror, barely recognizing the man who looked back at him. The suit was indeed a bit tight, and his tie was slightly out of style, but he looked respectable, professional even. As he locked his apartment door, his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patel, came out of her unit. "My goodness, Carlos," she exclaimed. "Don't you look handsome? Hot date?" Carlos smiled shyly. "No, Mrs. Patel, I'm playing the piano at a school fundraiser." Her eyes widened. "You play the piano? In all these years I never knew. There's a lot people don't know about me," he said, surprised by his own candor. "Well, good luck. I'm sure you'll be wonderful." Carlos arrived at Westridge High 2 hours before the concert was scheduled to begin. He slipped in through a side entrance, not wanting to encounter anyone just yet. The school felt different in his suit, as if he were a visitor rather than an employee. He made his way to the auditorium, which was still empty except for a few students setting up chairs on the stage for the orchestra. They looked up in surprise when he entered. "Mr. Mendez?" one of them said uncertainly. Carlos nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Ms. Reynolds said you can use the music office to warm up," the student continued, pointing to a door off stage left. "There's a keyboard in there." "Thank you," Carlos said, heading in that direction. The music office was small but private. A digital keyboard sat on a desk in the corner. Carlos took off his suit jacket, hung it carefully on the back of a chair, and sat down at the keyboard. He put on the headphones connected to it and began to play, his fingers moving silently over the keys. As he played, memories washed over him. His first recital at age 7, his teacher's stern but kind guidance, the smell of polish on his grandfather's piano, his mother's proud tears, the thunderous applause at the National Theater. Music had been his life once. Now, for one night at least, it would be again. A knock at the door startled him. Ms. Reynolds peeked in, already dressed in a formal black dress. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Better now," he said, removing the headphones. The keyboard helped. She smiled. "We're opening the doors in 30 minutes. The auditorium is going to be packed. Word has spread all over town about our mysterious pianist." She hesitated. "I hope that's okay. I didn't use your name in the publicity, just called you a special guest artist." Carlos took a deep breath. "It's fine, though I'm hardly an artist anymore." "Once an artist, always an artist," she said firmly. "The principal wants to meet you. By the way, he's in shock that his janitor is about to be the star of the fundraiser." Carlos winced. "That might be awkward." "He's not upset," Ms. Reynolds assured him. "Just amazed, like the rest of us." She checked her watch. "I should go help the students get ready. The orchestra plays first, then you'll come on after intermission." After she left, Carlos returned to the keyboard, but found he couldn't concentrate. Instead, he sat quietly, trying to calm his racing heart. Outside the office, he could hear the growing buzz of the audience arriving, the sound of the orchestra tuning up, the excited chatter of students. At exactly 7 p.m., the concert began. Carlos listened as the student orchestra played through. Their program, a little rough in places but full of enthusiasm. He found himself smiling at their effort, remembering his own student performances. Then, all too quickly, it was intermission. Ms. Reynolds knocked on his door. "Ready?" she asked. "You're on in 15 minutes. Carlos nodded, standing up and putting on his jacket. His hands were cold, an old pre-performance symptom he had almost forgotten about. He rubbed them together, trying to warm them up. As he waited in the wings, Principal Walker approached him, looking somewhat awkward in his formal attire. "Mr. Mendez," he said, extending his hand. "Ms. Reynolds has told me about your background. I had no idea we had such talent on our staff." Carlos shook his hand. "I haven't played publicly in a very long time, sir." "Well, we're honored that you're doing so tonight, and grateful." The principal lowered his voice. "Between us, ticket sales have already covered half our budget shortfall. If donations are good tonight, we might just save the music program." Carlos felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever happened next, at least he had helped with that. The intermission ended, and the audience returned to their seats. From his position off stage, Carlos could see the auditorium was indeed full. His pulse quickened. Ms. Reynolds walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. She approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your support tonight. Your presence here is a powerful statement about the importance of music education in our community." She paused. "Our next performer is someone many of you see every day, though you may not have noticed him. He has worked at Westridge High for 17 years, quietly maintaining our building while keeping a remarkable secret." Another pause. "Until this week, none of us knew that our own Mr. Mendez was once a concert pianist, trained at the National Conservatory of El Salvador, and a performer with their National Symphony." A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. "Tonight, after 17 years of silence, he will play for us. Please welcome Carlos Mendez." The applause was polite but curious as Carlos walked onto the stage. He saw confusion on many faces as they recognized the school janitor in his slightly too tight suit. He caught sight of Lily Chen in the third row, her eyes wide with surprise and delight. He sat down at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. The audience fell silent, waiting. For a terrible moment, Carlos thought he might freeze. The spotlight felt hot, the silence oppressive. Then he looked down at the keys, black and white, familiar and constant. He took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of Bach's Prelude in C major filled the auditorium, simple, clear, perfect. Carlos felt his nervousness fade as the music took over, as it always had. His fingers remembered. His body remembered. His heart remembered what it was to make music. As the Bach drew to a close, there was a moment of stunned silence before the applause began, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Carlos moved directly into the Chopin without pausing, not wanting to break the spell. The ballade began softly, questioning, then built in intensity and emotion. Carlos poured everything into it. His lost years, his fears, his hopes, his rediscovered joy. His body swayed with the music, his face transformed by concentration and passion. When the final chords of the Chopin rang out, the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. Carlos stood and bowed, feeling dizzy with emotion. But his performance wasn't over yet. He sat down again and for the first time that evening spoke into the microphone placed near the piano. "This last piece is something I composed many years ago for my mother," he said simply. "It's called Recuerdos, Memories." And as he began to play his own music that had lived only in his mind for 17 years, Carlos knew with certainty that whatever happened tomorrow, his long silence was over. The first notes of Recuerdos floated over the audience like a gentle breeze. Carlos played softly, tenderly, his fingers caressing the keys rather than striking them. The melody was simple but haunting, a child's lullaby twisted with an adult's understanding of loss and longing. In the third row, Lily Chen sat perfectly still, afraid that even breathing might break the spell. She had passed Mr. Mendez Carlos in the hallway hundreds of times, had chatted with him about math tests and paper flowers, but never once had she imagined this depth of feeling existed behind his quiet smile. As the piece developed, growing, more complex, more passionate, Carlos closed his eyes. He was no longer aware of the audience, the school, the years of silence. He was playing for his mother, for his homeland, for the young man he had once been. The music spoke of sun-drenched plazas and mountain vistas, of laughter and tears, of home and exile. Principal Walker, standing at the back of the auditorium, felt a lump form in his throat. He had always treated Carlos with basic respect, but had he ever really seen him? Had he ever wondered about the life behind those careful, polite interactions? The music seemed to rebuke him gently for his blindness. In the wings, Ms. Reynolds watched with tears streaming down her face. She had known Carlos was good. She had heard him play Bach beautifully, but this was something else entirely. This was raw emotion translated directly into sound, bypassing words, bypassing thought, speaking directly to the heart. The piece built to a climax, Carlos's hands moving faster, the notes tumbling over each other like a mountain stream, then suddenly quieting again, returning to the simple theme from the beginning but now tinged with a sweet melancholy that made it even more beautiful. The final notes hung in the air, then faded to silence. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The audience sat frozen, caught in the spell Carlos had woven around them. Then someone in the back began to clap, followed by another, then another, until the entire auditorium erupted in thunderous applause. Carlos opened his eyes, returning to the present moment. He stood and bowed, his face flushed with emotion. The applause continued, growing louder. People began to stand, first a few, then entire rows, until the whole audience was on their feet, clapping, cheering, some wiping away tears. Carlos looked out at them in wonder. He had forgotten this feeling, the communion between performer and audience, the shared journey of music. He bowed again, deeper this time, his hand over his heart in gratitude. Ms. Reynolds came onto the stage, beaming through her tears. She handed him a bouquet of flowers, then leaned in to whisper in his ear. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said. "Thank you." Carlos nodded, too overcome to speak. He took the flowers and bowed once more to the still applauding audience, then walked off stage, his legs slightly unsteady. In the wings, several music students waited, looking at him with new eyes. They surged around him, exclaiming and asking questions all at once. "That was amazing. Where did you learn to play like that? Will you teach me that piece? I can't believe you're our janitor." This last comment came from a tall boy with a violin case. He immediately looked embarrassed, but Carlos just smiled. "I am your janitor," he said gently, "and also a pianist. We are all many things." Ms. Reynolds shooed the students away. Give Mr. Mendez some space. He'll be at the reception in the cafeteria if you have questions. After the students left, Carlos sat down heavily on a chair, suddenly exhausted. The emotional toll of the performance, combined with the weeks of tension leading up to it, had drained him completely. Ms. Reynolds sat beside him. "You did it," she said softly. "I did," he agreed, sounding surprised. "It felt like coming home?" she suggested. He nodded. "Yes. Exactly like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Ms. Reynolds said, "Principal Walker wants to speak with you, and there's a reception in the cafeteria. But if you're too tired—" Carlos shook his head. "No, I'll go. This night is about raising money for the music program after all." "About that?" Ms. Reynolds said with a grin. "We've already raised over $15,000 and people are still donating." Carlos's eyes widened. "15,000? Your performance touched people," she said simply. "They want to make sure other students have the chance to find their music too." The reception was held in the transformed cafeteria, decorated with twinkling lights and tablecloths to hide the scratched tables. When Carlos entered, a hush fell over the room, followed by another round of applause. He made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions. Many people apologized for never having properly noticed him before, which Carlos waved away good-naturedly. Others asked about his background, listening with fascination to the brief version of his story that he felt comfortable sharing. Lily Chen appeared at his elbow. "Mr. M," she said, "that was the most beautiful music I've ever heard." "Thank you, Lily," he replied warmly. "My dad wants to meet you," she said. "He's on the school board." She led him to a well-dressed man who extended his hand. "Mr. Mendez, I'm David Chen, Lily's father. Your performance was extraordinary." "Thank you," Carlos said, shaking his hand. "I must admit I was one of the board members pushing for the arts budget cuts," Mr. Chen confessed. "I always saw music as extracurricular, not essential." He looked at Carlos intently. "I was wrong. What you played tonight wasn't just beautiful, it was necessary. It reminded us all of what it means to be human." Carlos was stunned by the man's candor. "That's very kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's truth," Mr. Chen replied. "And I plan to tell the rest of the board the same thing at our next meeting." Similar conversations continued throughout the evening. Parents who had been indifferent to the music program now pledged their support. Students who had never considered taking music classes asked about joining band or orchestra. Teachers who had barely noticed Carlos now saw him as a colleague with valuable insights. Principal Walker found him near the punch bowl. "Mr. Mendez, Carlos, I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" Carlos asked. "For never seeing you," the principal replied. "For treating you as just part of the building like the walls or the floors, instead of as the remarkable person you are." Carlos smiled. "We're all guilty of not seeing each other completely," he said. "It's a human failing." Walker nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I hope you know that things will be different now, and not just because you can play the piano like a virtuoso." He hesitated, then added, "Though I have to ask, do you want things to change? Do you want to keep working as our janitor? Because I'm sure the music department would be thrilled to have you in some capacity." Carlos considered the question seriously. "I don't know," he admitted. "For 17 years, being invisible felt safe. Being seen, really seen, is new for me. I need time to think about it." "Of course," Walker said. "The offer stands whenever you're ready." By the time the reception wound down, Carlos was exhausted, but filled with a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. As people said their goodbyes, Ms. Reynolds approached him one last time. "I checked the final numbers," she said excitedly. "With tonight's donations, we've raised over $22,000. The music program is saved." Carlos smiled broadly. "That's wonderful news." "And it's all because of you," she said. "You didn't just play the piano tonight, Carlos. You changed the way people think about music, about art, about each other." He shook his head modestly. "The music did that. I just let it speak. Well, whatever it was, I'm grateful. She hesitated, then asked, will you play again? For the spring concert, perhaps? Carlos looked around the room, at the school that had been his silent home for 17 years. He thought about the students who now looked at him with respect and curiosity, the faculty who now saw him as more than just the man who fixed their leaky faucets, the community that had been moved by his music. Yes, he said finally. I think I will. As he walked to the bus stop that night, still wearing his slightly too tight suit, Carlos looked up at the stars. For the first time in many years, he felt truly alive, truly himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, questions, expectations, decisions about his future. But whatever came next, he would face it with music in his heart again. The next morning, Carlos arrived at school at his usual early hour. He put on his gray uniform and went about his regular tasks, mopping floors, changing light bulbs, fixing what was broken. But something was different. As students began to fill the hallways, they didn't flow around him like water around a stone. They stopped. They smiled. They said, "Good morning." In the music room, he found a note taped to the small, upright piano, "Practice whenever you like, Ms. Reynolds," and taped below it, another note in childish handwriting. "Thank you for showing us that people are more than what they seem. Lily." Carlos carefully removed both notes and tucked them into his pocket, close to his heart. Then he took out his ring of keys and continued down the hallway, whistling softly, a new melody forming in his mind, ready to be played.